Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're doing day 12, inheritance. Inheritance is an object-oriented programming concept where if we have a base class as well as a child class, if we want the child class to inherit from the base or parent class for its properties as well as its methods, we can make that child class extend or inherit from that base or parent class. In this task, we're given exactly that, a person class, which is the base or a parent class, and the student class, which is the child or the derived class. And in this case, notice on line 1 to line 8, HackerRank has already implemented the base or parent class person for us. The constructor is already defined from line 2 to line 5, and the instance method printPerson is already defined on line 6 to line 8. For this task, we have to implement the incomplete student class, and notice that this student class is already inheriting from this person base class. Our job will be to define the constructor, which takes in one additional parameter which is not defined in the person's constructor, and one additional instance method, calculate, that takes in this additional integer array scores, calculate the average, and perform a couple of conditional statements with regard to this grading scale to print out the corresponding letter. So for the input format, we have 3 lines. The first line defines the first name, the last name, and the ID number, and they are both separated by the spaces. The second line contains the number of test scores, and the third line consists of the scores themselves. And the output in this case would be the name, followed by the ID and the grade. But in this case, the output is already handled by HackerRank, so there's really no need for us to handle the input and the output. All we have to do is to implement the class blueprint from line 10 to line 25, and if everything works out well, we should get the sample output. So the concept for getting in the input is quite similar to the previous questions, so I will not be going through them. So we'll be focusing more on the implementation on line 10 to line 25. So let's get started. First, let's define the constructor. The constructor in Python is this _init method. Remember that because this is the constructor, the first parameter will always be self, which is referring to the object itself, and that is followed by the parameters to these constructors. The first parameter will be the first name, second will be the last name, third will be the ID. In this case, let's just call this the ID number, and this will be equals to an integer, and finally the scores, which will be a list of integer. And because this is a constructor, we'll be returning the type student. Let's import the optional type hint from typing import list. And once we're done, we're ready to start defining the constructor's implementation. So there are a few ways to go about this. One way for us, notice that the constructor for person and the student would be very similar. So if we copied line 3 to line 5 and just paste it like this would work. And on top of that, because we also have an additional parameter which is scores, we also want to assign these scores as a property to this student object. So let's just set this to scores, and that is one way for us to define a constructor. The second way would be to use a property of inheritance, which is the super method. The super method allows us to access the parent's constructor itself and reuse the code on line 3 to line 5, which sets the first name, last name, and the ID number property. So to access this parent constructor, what we can do is call the super method. The super method doesn't take in any parameter, and after the super method, you can call the method on the parent class that you like to call. And notice that in this case, sure enough, you can see that the type signature of init takes in 3 parameters, just like what is defined on line 2 to line 5. Pass in the first name, the last name, as well as the as the ID number. And in this case, we will leave line 24 because the parent's constructor does not set the score property for us. So we are done with the constructor over here. The next step will be to define the calculate function. So the calculate function in this case will not take in anything. It will just take in self because this is an instance method, and this returns back a string. So the first step will be to define the average of all scores for this student object over here. So let's define average. Average will be a float, and we can calculate the average of the scores property by taking the sum of the scores and divide that by the length of the scores. And once we are done, we have the average. And subsequently, from this point onwards, it will just be a sequence of conditional statements that we are comfortable with after the past few challenges. So I'll be speeding across this implementation. So if the average is more than or equals to 90, then the letter return will be O. Else if the average is more than or equals to 80, then we return E. Else if average is more than or equals to 70, then we return A. Else if the average is more than or equals to 55, then we return P. Else if average is more than or equals to 40, return D. And finally, if the score is less than 40, return T. And that's pretty much the implementation for this additional instance method. This passes all the test cases. Let's submit this code. And this passes all the test cases. In summary, if we focus on the new concept strictly, the first thing that you have to learn from this practice is that if you want a class to inherit from another parent class for all its properties and methods, just beside the class definition, the class name, remember to wrap the child class that you wish to inherit from with brackets like this. This is how you would have student class inherit from the person class. The second thing that we learned today is also how we can call the parent methods with the super function over here. The super function will return a parent object, and with this parent object, you can call all of the methods that's associated with this parent object. This will allow you to reuse code from the parent class without having to do code duplication otherwise. And that's pretty much it for this question. If you find this useful, please give us a like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next question.